Adaptation Forum webinar series hosted by EcoAdapt. This webinar is the online convening of the adaptation community between biennial National Adaptation Forum events. Visit the National Adaptation Forum website to learn more about past fora and start preparing for the next one scheduled for spring 2019. I'm Laura Hansen, Chief Scientist and Executive Director of EcoAdapt, and I'll be your moderator for today's webinar. The title of today's episode is One Stick at a Time in Pursuit of Climate Adaptation for a More Sustainable Future. And it will be our first webinar film screening, so new technology afoot, which will be following with a discussion on how various folks in the region and as part of this film are really making adaptation happen. Before we get started, I'd like to go through some housekeeping rules to ensure a successful webinar. Please place your telephone, cell phone, or computer on mute. This really helps us reduce feedback and makes it a more listenable experience for anyone. If you're using a microphone voice over IP option, please ensure you place your computer on mute, even if you're listed as muted when you log in. We will have time after the presentations for Q&A. Throughout the webinar, you can use the question function to submit questions to presenters. We'll do our best to answer all of them. You can raise your hand and we can call on you and unmute you to ask questions directly if there's time. You can also use the chat function to report any technical problems you might be encountering, and we'll try our best to help address any problems to ensure you have a favorable webinar experience. The chat function can be also used to communicate between attendees as ways to emphasize a point heard during the presentation. We encourage you to share ideas with colleagues and fellow listeners that way. And finally, I wanted to let you know that we'll be recording and posting the webinar on the Climate Adaptation Knowledge Exchange website for future viewing. This should be available online next week and can be viewed at cakex.org. Presentations will also be available online as PDFs in EcoAdapt site at ecoadapt.org/webinars. Today's panel includes Kent Woodruff, a retiring Forest Service wildlife biologist and Methow Beaver project coordinator, also the filmmaker of this presentation. Amelia Marchand of the Colville Confederated Tribes Water Regulatory Specialist in their Environmental Trust Department. Lynn Helbrecht from the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, where she's the climate change coordinator, and Molly Cross, who's the North American Program Climate Change Adaptation Coordinator for the Wildlife Conservation Society. We have a lot of people coordinating climate change on this call, so hopefully everything will be solved soon. The film we'll be watching today, One Stick at a Time, follows land managers in the Methow Valley of Washington for over a year, from forests to rivers, from fires to snowfall, from beaver capture to release, as they try to come to grips with the impacts of climate change and the possible adaptation options right in front of them. It is a conversation starter for answering the question, what can I do? With support from the best climate experts in the Northwest, it's a chance for each of us to think about how our landscape will be like 10 decades from now. It's a nudge to start today to make our surroundings better than they would be if we did nothing. The film was conceived as part of the 10 Decades Project, the goal of which is to inspire thousands of us to take measurable, concrete steps for climate adaptation in every area for which we are responsible. Again, please make sure that you have muted your phone, and with that, let's roll the film.
In my 25-year career here, to go from 10,000 acres being a big fire to 30,000 to 80,000 to 120 to 175 to 260 last year, and this year over 600,000. There are few of us that can ignore the overwhelming nature of that change.
I look at 2014 and 2015 as a dress rehearsal for climate change because the conditions we experienced were almost identical to what all of these projections have been describing. Big fires, a lot of drought stress in the forests, really warm streams and really low stream flow. Did we like how that went? If the answer is no, then the question is, well, what do we do about that? For a long time, people have thought about climate change in terms of something that's happening in the future. But the truth of the matter is that that increasing level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is already changing the environment around us. And as a result of that, you need to start thinking about two kinds of actions. One are the mitigation actions, which is what we do to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and decrease that amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. The other half of what we need to do is called adaptation, which is how we prepare for and respond to the impacts of climate change to be able to continue to have the things that are important, be they natural resources and wildlife, or they human communities and human wants and needs.
In adaptation, we're assuming that the climate is warming and it's going to continue to warm and have some effects on different types of ecosystems. So adaptation describes a whole suite of actions that can be used to try to reduce the negativity of those outcomes or help us transition systems into the future.
In the face of drier times, in the face of less snow, in the face of more volatile stream conditions, there are things that we can do to make things better than they are going to be if we don't. I think we have a responsibility to say, let's do our best work, better than we've ever done before. Let's do the best work that we can do. And let's start tomorrow.
The Methow is unique in that it's one of the largest ranger districts in the nation at 1.3 million acres. The biodiversity, the different species that we have out there, the richness that's out there is valuable and important. And the people who live and work in the Methow understand how special it really is. As an agency, we're looking ahead at what the future looks like, and climate change plays a huge role in that.
Restoration is a really important thing for us to be working on. We know that. Adding climate change is another level of complexity. We're working as an agency to try to rebuild resilience, to restore ecosystem function.
We know enough to act because we know what the shape of the future is. And we know that building resilience to those changes isn't something we can do overnight. We're already stretched with what we can do year to year, and it's going to take time. So we can't wait until we've fallen off the cliff before we apply the brakes.
A lot of these ecosystems had more parts at one point, some of which are missing now. The only way that I know of to actually set the table for a more resilient future is to look at those pieces which beget stability and diversity. And that's what's so exciting about the Beaver project as a restoration technique.
For more than 10,000 years, beavers were on the landscape throughout North America. Beavers had a tremendously positive role on our stream ecosystems. They built dams, they created wetlands, they shaped all of our streams and rivers. And then suddenly they were gone. In a very short period of time, we trapped out nearly all the beavers that were here in North America. In the face of climate change, we're going to need the complexity that beavers provide. The Methow Beaver Project captures beavers in live traps on private land, low in the watershed, and moves them up onto public land and releases them as family groups to recover some of the functions that have been missing for 200 years.
The answer has been there right in front of us for an awful long time, and I think that this is our chance to do something simple and beautiful with a tool that's at our disposal.
It is so cool to come back in months, sometimes even weeks, and see a dam established that then captures more water, stores it underground, millions and millions of gallons of water, They capture the sediment that's there, they improve riparian habitat, they create cooler water. Nature's powerful. Beavers, they know how to interact with this landscape.
You do this in one particular spot, but all of a sudden the magnitude of effect is like well beyond where you put the project on the ground. And to me, like, that's what we need to be doing. That's how we quadruple our effort.
For me, one of the most exciting things about adaptation is this interface between creativity and management, and not just continuing to do what we've always done.
I really believe in my staff and the creativity that they have, and so for me it's about establishing a goal or a vision for them and then allowing them to be able to come up with their own solutions. So for instance, I think the Beaver project is a great example of creatively solving what might otherwise be a significant engineering task.
It seems like that approach, that humble approach to be able to say, here's where we can cooperate with nature, instead of the multiple examples that we have of fighting nature. So fighting the forest fires, fighting the floods by rip-wrapping the rivers, instead plunking a couple of beavers in there and letting them do things more effectively than we'll ever be able to do them. That might be a little bit of a clue for us as we walk forward into climate adaptation.
Forests matter for so many reasons. If you want clean water, you need a healthy forest to filter that water. We need to have the story out there that fire is. It has always been here. It is crucial for it to be here, and we must be able to live with it.
We can't fight this. We can't resist it. There is no way that we can put up a wall and stop wildfire in the American West, but we can modify fire behavior with some assertive action by reducing hazardous fuels and by thinning forests to reduce their density, so they will not prevent fires, but they'll reduce the intensity of fires when they occur.
The sentence of "we need to do restoration work" has already been there. The climate change is the exclamation points at the end of the sentence. We have needed to do this for years, and now it is, you really need to do it. You really need to do it. For me now, looking forward, I really want to see effective, ecologically sensitive and complete areas treated so we can preserve the function of the forest. We can leave the forest intact now and into the future, because the future does hold fire. The future holds change. And I don't want to go out into my forest and see 200,000 acres of black and think to myself, why weren't we able to do something here?
The beauty of thinking about adaptation is that rather than just accept that there is change happening that is bigger than you and you can't do anything about because you can't reduce enough greenhouse gas emissions personally to affect global climate change, what it does allow you to say is that I'm going to try and improve the outcome of what it is I work on to the best of my ability, to get to a future that gives me something that I'm still proud of and feel like is delivering what needs to be delivered on.
Everything is hitched to everything else, and if we want the areas around us provide us not only with the economic sustenance, but the spiritual sustenance that we need to make it through our days, then green forests, growing forests, healthy, resilient forests matter for us.
In the late 1990s, there were places on the district here that were completely broken. We knew something was completely out of whack. My boss, John Rohr, said, let's see if we can't put beavers back in those places.
It was a large wet meadow system. It had been overgrazed. It was eroding. The wetland species were being replaced with weed species, and the stream was down cutting. And so they had started this project to try to reverse that. Nothing ever worked. But looking at the meadow system, you could see that there had been historically there'd been beaver dams in there. So after that we decided, all right, let's do it. Let's try it. Let's catch some beavers and put them in here.
And that's been the paradigm for us for a long, long time. For us as biologists, we're going to try to fix things and repair things to put things back like they used to be.
The history of conservation in Western society has all been about maintaining a historic ideal of what the landscape looked like. In order to make adaptation part of good land management, rather than trying to come up with what was the past ideal, you need to think about what is the future ideal and think about managing for change. Because the problem is climate will continue to change because of what we've put into play for decades and centuries and millennia to come.
Don't think about what the conditions are today. Think about what the conditions may be 50 to 100 years from now. And that sets a very different target than if you were to look, say, at the past 50 to 100 years.
It isn't just putting a Band-Aid on this particular spot right here and now, which is truthfully what we've done most of the time, because it's really easy to spot something on the landscape that's gone awry. But when you think more holistically and more long-term about species and ecosystems and ultimately their resilience, it really means providing landscape-level connectivity, landscape-level function that allows them to thrive, reproduce, and do it all over again.
Maybe we don't need to take it back to a state of where it was historically, but we can try to move it to a state that we think will be more resilient.
It is what we need to be doing for retaining as much forest function as we can.
In the Methow watershed, we have 3 species of fish that are listed under the Endangered Species Act. What concerns me most is that things are changing at a rate that a lot of the species are not well adapted to. What we're seeing now is a really low number of spawning bull trout compared to earlier years in the last decade. So it's a concern, and when we start looking into the future and seeing some of the scenarios that have water temperatures warming rapidly over the next 50 years, that's going to be another driver that's going to really challenge bull trout in terms of their persistence in our watershed.
We often hear that people don't know where to start with this, and when people look at what climate change means, they get this huge laundry list of all the potential impacts, and they already have a huge to-do list from their existing job. But there are a lot of tractable ways to move forward. So if all else was equal, you might prioritize the places where the impacts are going to be biggest, or you might prioritize the impacts that are likely to happen first, or where the species you care most about are most threatened, or where your action would ameliorate one of these impacts of climate change.
One of the most important things I see now that we can do to provide some sense of resilience for our watershed in the future is to locate and protect as much as possible our sources of cold water. Part of that is just understanding what we have now so that we can approach climate change with intention and understanding and knowledge rather than approaching it blindly. The watershed we're restoring now may not be the watershed that we're going to end up with in 10 generations. It's going to be a different place, and so we need to be prepared to manage our ecosystems in a different way in the future because they may be comprised of a much different suite of plant and animal communities.
One of the first sunny days in April a few years ago, I needed to get out of the office, and so I drove up north of town and just started to take a walk. And it was then that I was thinking about some of the things that I had been reading. It was a day that I said, I don't believe it. I don't believe that I finally came to the realization that things are going to be way different than I've been imagining for the roadmap for my entire life. was actually a grieving moment. It was a moment where I said, I hurt because there are things that are going to change that we're not going to be able to touch. We're going to have more fire. We're going to lose some things that are valuable to us. We are not going to be able to put snow back in the Cascades.
I think one of the reasons that climate change is so hard to talk about and why so many people working on the issue feel a lot of deep and complicated personal emotions about it is that some degree of loss is inevitable, if only by virtue of saying that the world is going to be different.
Studying a species that does seem to be in such a tenuous position because of something so huge and seemingly unstoppable like climate change and its gigantic fires can be really sad and discouraging.
Given lynx's preference for areas that have prolonged periods of deep soft snow, all the climate models would suggest we're going to have less and less of that moving forward. That probably doesn't bode well for lynx.
We're not trying to just document the demise of a species that's facing climate change. We're gathering clues and evidence to help us know how to help them.
Oftentimes there's not a lot we can do with a specific individual species. What we can do, though, is try to keep the landscape as permeable to animal movement and as connected as we can, or try to reduce or minimize fragmentation to give animals a chance to adapt.
I just wouldn't be happy with myself if I wasn't trying to fight climate change and figure out ways to adapt, knowing that this catastrophe is our fault.
It is unfortunate that we have caused this, and it is frustrating that we as a society are not taking seriously enough stopping it, despite the very clear evidence that we are causing it. The question is, do you want to have a voice in creating the world that you live in, or do you want to let it just happen around you?
I think that somewhere down the road we're going to wake up and realize that, killing the planet is not a good idea, and we're going to change our ways and move towards a more sustainable future.
Dealing with the grief that we have in climate change, of the things that we're about to lose, of the things that we've already lost, we are not responsible managers if we do turn our back and say what happens is going to happen. If we can just swallow that pill and say, okay, we got it. Here's the way things are going to change. Let's find ways to soften those impacts. When we started, one of the things that was really foremost on my mind is, can we figure out how to pull this off? To say, okay, let's try to do this and see if we can whisper in beavers' ears and help them stay in a place that we asked them to stay. Now that we know we can pull it off, after 4 or 5 years of saying, yep, I think we got this, then it became easier to say, now let's do this with more intention. Let's do this in a very conscious way. And some of the things that the Climate Impacts Group at the University of Washington put together, there's some really good information that helped us say, what about this as a tool for climate adaptation? And it's working. Improving beaver populations in watersheds anticipates that snowpack loss by storing water. It anticipates fire impacts by providing fire breaks. It creates better riparian recovery by raising water levels in the soil. When we have multiple beaver dams in a stream, that helps the flood impact be dissipated. And so, again, we're anticipating the flood impacts if we can really bolster our beaver populations.
Beavers are still only going to be one tool in the toolbox, but It's emblematic of the types of things that I think we need to do more of, which is put the component pieces in place that sets the trajectory for future improvement that goes beyond what we did on the ground in that spot at that time.
We here in the Northwest are really rich with resources and knowledge and capacity for dealing with climate impacts. And we are just so well poised for going the next step, which is applying the best combination of science and local intuition about our systems and embedding this in what we do everywhere across the landscape and across our communities.
Adaptation is not a sprint, it's a marathon. And so I feel like if I'm doing anything worthwhile, it will be to prepare the younger people in our resource agencies and other organizations to take this on.
We really need to be embracing the idea that we've already set in motion our future. We've already set the trajectory in many cases. It's really more how do we guide that future to be within a range of acceptable conditions that we like.
That's what adaptation gives you. It gives you the power to say, I'm thinking about what the future will be like, I'm thinking about how to do my job differently, and I'm thinking about how to get good long-term outcomes.
You can't do everything, but you can do something. And so when I feel maybe overwhelmed or my staff feels like there's just so much to do, trying to focus on what we can do rather than what we can't do. Hopefully that encourages my staff to be creative, to want to try to do something now, and just continue to value and to appreciate all that we have.
If we can start in this next decade doing things a little like a beaver, one stick at a time, that might be the way to tackle climate change incrementally and find solutions, one decade at a time.
Such a fascinating array of work going on in the region based on some universal truths that are really applicable anywhere. Kent, Beaver Whisperer, would you be kind enough to lead off the conversation?
Sure, just a couple of quick acknowledgments. The film was made possible by the Wildlife Conservation Society's Climate Adaptation Fund. They gave us a grant to build this film, and I really appreciate their support. Also, I want to thank the people that participated in the film, especially you, Laura, and Amy Snover, a couple of key voices in the film. And then Sarah Konigsberg is the filmmaker who took on the daunting task of tackling dozens of hours of footage and hundreds of hours of trying to figure out how to edit this into a reasonable film. So I think I felt like it came out really well. And I hope those of you that are participating today enjoyed it. Now we're going to share a little bit with you of some of the people that are close here in the Northwest for the work that they're doing, and we're going to start with Lynn Helbrecht with the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife.
Lynn, I think you might be muted. Can you unmute yourself?
Lynn, we don't hear you. We'd like to see if we can unmute. Let's come back to Lynn.
Great idea.
So we'll take a look at a couple of examples of the things that are going on here in Washington. North Central Washington, we cooperate with the Department of Natural Resources, and thinning is one of the things that we have embraced as a climate adaptation solution. It allows fire managers a few more options. As you can see in this picture, the before and after picture on the left and the right, we have a lot less fuel on the picture on the right. That gives fire managers a chance to tackle a fire that might come through here, brings more snow on the ground, and increases water delivery when there's less evapotranspiration. Next slide. So this is an example of some of the prescribed burning that we are doing across the West, but it's a perfect climate adaptation because, again, reducing fuel and lowering fire intensity of future fires is something that works well to help us have adaptation solutions or adaptation options when fire comes. The final example that we have here on the Methow Valley Ranger District for the Forest Service is removing roads from our system, and decommissioning those roads allows more water infiltration and reduces sediment delivery. So especially for fish management in the coming decades, we know that we're going to have to find as many softeners or buffers for the impacts of climate change, and reducing road densities and allowing water to infiltrate on the current road surfaces after we decommission those roads. Not only that, but we increase carbon storage when we put trees back in these places that used to be roads. So now, Amelia, if you can take a moment and share some of the things that are going on there with you. You'll need to unmute as well.
And I think I'm on now. This is Lynn. So whenever you're ready for me, I think you can step in.
Okay, let's go with Amelia right now, and then we'll come right back to Lynn. Amelia, are you there, Amelia?
I'm here.
Okay.
Is there an echo at all?
Not on my end.
Okay. So, good morning, everyone. Tatsumeli in Mwaswanix, white and chai squeeze knops. Thank you.
Speak close to your speaker there, Amelia. We'll hear you a little better.
All right, is that better? At all?
Pretty quiet.
I'm not sure if you're getting me through the computer or through my phone.
That's better.
Okay, so I work with the Colville Tribe's Environmental Trust Department, And we can go ahead and go on to the next slide, please. So for those of you that are not familiar with where the Colville Tribes is located, we are a confederacy of 12 different tribes, and our traditional territories extended throughout much of eastern Washington, some of southeastern Washington into Oregon, and then also up into British Columbia. And so the reason why I wanted to share this slide also is because we have significant natural resource and cultural resource interests in these areas. And these are shared interests with other tribes in the region and First Nations in Canada. So for land use, water use issues, development, habitat, all those reasons. Can you go on to the next slide, please? So one of the things that the Colville Tribes has been doing, I guess kind of early on, we started working with the University of Washington Climate Impacts Group and the Okanagan Nation Alliance, which is up in Canada, on a transboundary habitat connectivity project. And so that really works at some of the habitat, I guess, work that we're trying to do. But more recently, the tribe's Fish and Wildlife Department received a grant to write a climate vulnerability assessment. And so that's a project that I'm involved with, as well as other natural resource departments and other departments within the Colville Tribes. One of the major projects within that is a traditional ecological knowledge project. And among this, there's also different watershed restoration projects that Environmental Trust and the Fish and Wildlife Department conduct. We also have an emergency management program that is updating their hazard mitigation plan, among other plans, and really incorporating a lot of the new climate change data into it that affects our systems, basically our I don't know what the word is, our human systems, I guess, and infrastructure. And then as discussed in the previous video, one of the things that our forestry and our fire management program really has been working on is prescribed fires and pre-commercial thinning, PCTs, in our forests. So those are some of the ongoing projects that the Colville Tribe is involved in. And I included some of the other jurisdictions that we have to coordinate with where we are. It's not just the tribal government. There's a variety of other agencies that we have to coordinate with for a number of different land use and planning projects and NEPA processes and SEPA processes. So can you go to the next slide, please? So one of the things that was discussed very briefly in the video was this term spiritual sustenance. And I wrote that down because that is a perfect example of this slide. So for tribal peoples and indigenous peoples, First Nations, our food is not just our medicine. Our food is who we are. Our food is where we come from. And what you have before you is Ntitish, Speechum, Sia, Skachinum, Squinquinum, Schwachalusa, Etilch, Squuquum, Stashk. And those are some of the what might be called the first foods or the traditional foods that are from this land, from those territories that I showed you. And those are in different languages depending on what tribe you're from. And there's many, many more. This is just like a handful. And so why I'm showing this to you, this image of these first foods, these traditional foods, this is from a flyer for our first food ceremony that the language program, the Cobble Tribes language program, and the Cobble Tribes diabetes program put together. They had 2 different root feasts this past spring. And the reason why I include a picture of a wetland on the left, this is one of the wetlands on our reservation, is our root feasts, our ceremonies always start with water. Water is the beginning and water is the end of many of our ceremonies. If you're a member of the Nez Perce Longhouse, or if you practice Chinook dances or jump dances or winter dances, water is a very, very important. Doesn't matter what tribe you're from. So when we talk about spiritual sustenance, we need to also remember this whole landscape and the diversity of the traditional foods, the first foods that were there. And there's so many impacts to these. And they've impacted the health of all of our people. Diabetes and obesity rates are in younger generations. And so what's happened for us on the Cobble Reservation is we're working to form a food policy council. And this kind of the core group of this food policy council right now is the language department, the diabetes prevention program, and the environmental trust department. We have a lot of other partners, distribution, range, fish and wildlife, a lot of people, WIC, that want to be involved as well. And we're going to be starting community outreach, getting input from our different districts. We've got 4 different districts on the reservation, and we really want to get our communities and our public engaged, not just about the traditional foods and how various impacts are either helping or harming the traditional foods, but also what concerns them, because the Cobble Reservation is a food desert. And we have some serious issues with food security and access to healthy foods. So
Amelia, we better give Lynn a chance to share some things too, and we will give folks a chance to connect with you after the webinar.
You're absolutely right. Thank you. So thank you so much. And the next slide is just the last one. There, you don't have to show it.
Thank you, Amelia. Lynn, please share your thoughts with us.
Yeah, thanks so much, Kent, for inviting me to participate, and hello to everybody. So Kent asked us to share one thing that we're doing, sort of our bit to contribute to the issues that were laid out in the film, and thank you again for the film, very beautifully done. So I work for the Department of Fish and Wildlife, and my position was established about 7 years ago, and the whole purpose is to guide the agency in understanding and addressing the risks of climate change. And this slide sort of lays out our very broad approach, sort of how we think about our work organizationally. And over the years, we've been at this a while, and then we had the good fortune to have a supportive director and a commission and a few resources directed at this. So we've done some great projects in science, habitat connectivity assessments, seminars, collaboration. We've done vulnerability assessments, and in integration, we've just recently completed a project that we're really excited about, where we looked at how to design culverts for future climate. So specifically the changes in peak flows. And that whole project was a real game changer for us in a number of ways. Number one, we have responsibility for ensuring that road crossing structures can support fish passage across the state. So this is a huge leverage point for us. So we could potentially influence design decisions for future conditions across the state. And the second reason it was a game changer is because we brought engineers to the table when we were working on this project with the climate scientists to make sure that the product was going to be useful on the ground. And it really made a difference, and the project looks definitely different than it would have been. So that's one example there. But that is all background and context to my one thing. The one thing I really wanted to share today was really about our evolution. So as we've done these projects over the years, it's been somewhat opportunistic. And I think we realized we really wanted to create more institutional support and backing for all the good projects underway. We really wanted to think about how do you create the incentive for staff to take these on? How do you create the the motivation, if you will, creating a more supportive environment. So we recently adopted a new policy, and I think this really helps in creating what I like to call this institutional architecture, something that's going to be there if my position goes away, something that helps to sort of build that supportive environment. And it's called, I'm happy to share it offline with anybody, it's called Addressing the Risks of Climate Change. I'm really proud of it because it took a lot to make it happen, and I think it's a big deal. And there's many parts to it. I want to mention three this morning. One is that it has a preamble that has a number of statements that clearly lay out the challenge of climate change relative to achieving our mission. It says it's happening now and that we cannot let the uncertainty inherent in climate modeling lead to inaction. I think that's really important, especially in today's political environment, to make sure that these statements are on record as part of the agency's operating framework. Secondly, it includes a set of principles for climate smart conservation. You know, a lot of what we do in the conservation world, by definition, can be considered to be helping to build resilience to climate change, restoring riparian areas, nearshore function, et cetera. But as folks in the film talked about, it's how we do that work with an eye towards future conditions. And it's not necessarily how we do it automatically. It's really it requires some clear intent to design to future conditions, to design for multiple futures, to design cognizant of multiple stressors, et cetera. And the third thing it does is it includes a list of activities that we have termed climate sensitive, things that the department does in terms of infrastructure, permitting, technical assistance in certain areas of our work where there's a directive to evaluate the risks of climate change and integrate appropriate options. It's aspirational. I'm not really sure where this policy is going to go from here, but it's certainly an invitation to the agency. It's in our framework, and I really feel like it's increased our ability to keep doing this work over the long haul. I think it has the potential to bring more rigor to our adaptation efforts, to clarify expectations for all staff, and most importantly, I feel that it gives every person in the agency sort of permission to think about how climate affects their work. Finally, just after we sent the announcement out just a couple months ago when this policy was approved, I got an email from one of our staff members in IT who said, this policy makes me proud to work here. So that really made my day. And that's really all I had to share. I'm happy to, as I say, talk more about this or any of our work with folks offline. I think we're turning it over to Molly now. Is that right?
Yeah, thanks, Lynn. And what a great story to end on there. So I'm Molly Cross. I work with the Wildlife Conservation Society, and I am our climate adaptation lead for North America, and starting to do a little bit of work in Latin America as well. And one of the real benefits of working in this position is that I get to see real-world adaptation actions taking shape on the ground on a regular basis, both within the landscapes where WCS works, but also through my work helping to run the WCS Climate Adaptation Fund, which, as Kent mentioned earlier, is a grant program that supports the implementation of adaptation projects for wildlife and ecosystem conservation in the United States. And so from that pool of projects that I have had the pleasure of getting to know over the years, I'm going to just highlight one. I actually was planning on two, but I'm going to keep it to one to keep it quick and to keep something that, and to provide an example. I was going to provide a US example and an international example from WCS's international work, but I'll stick closer to home and share an example of work that really inspires me. This is work that's being conducted by Eric Kalsta, who is a rancher in Southwest Montana. And I've had the real pleasure of getting to know Eric over the last several years. And as he and I have sat together and looked at his ranching operations and looked at the wildlife habitat that his property provides, as you can imagine, talking about the impacts of climate change for him as a rancher, it's not a lot of good news. There's a lot of bad news about changes that could have negative impacts to his operations, but also to, again, the wildlife habitat that his property houses. And what's really inspired me is that Eric doesn't just take that news and sort of throw up his hands and say, woe is me, what am I going to do? He's really thrown himself into doing a lot of his own research to figure out what are some strategies he can adopt that come from places that are more arid, like Israel and Africa. What are some techniques that he can bring to his ranch in Montana that can help the system better cope with some of the warming and drying that is likely coming our way and already being experienced in this area. One of the things he's doing, you can advance the slide, please, is looking at strategies for slowing down surface runoff and improving the infiltration of water and the buildup of soil moisture, and therefore benefits plant growth. And he's experimenting with things like simple rock dams on the left, on dry gullies that occasionally experience gully washer events, and trying to trap some of that water and allow it to stick around more for plant growth. The other is these contour ridges that he's developing alongside some of his sloped fields, again, trying to prevent some of the soil erosion that happens during heavy rain events. So again, those are just a couple of examples of work that Eric is doing alongside of many other things he's experimenting with that, again, are really inspiring to me to see the attitude he's taken and trying to approach this as a real problem-solving mentality. If you could skip ahead 2 slides, I'm going to skip my example from Fiji. You'll get to see, of course, the beautiful reef photo, but you'll have to follow up with me offline to learn more about our international work. But I just wanted to quickly point out that we do have a new report if you want to hear about 22 other projects that are taking action on the ground for adaptation. This is a report that's describing some of the projects that we're supporting through the Climate Adaptation Fund. It's called 14 Solutions to address 6 common problems that climate change poses for nature conservation. And so that's a new report you can find online or by contacting me, and I'll send out the link through the email list for this webinar. But those are just a couple of examples. I want to pass it over really to the audience to hear questions that you may have for any of us speakers and your challenges as you're sort of tackling this question of how can I take some actions on the ground in the face of a changing climate. I think I'm going to pass it over, Lara. Oh, there you are, Lara.
Yep, I'm right here. So please post any questions that you might have up on the website. We have one question from Shirley Baker, who asked if she could use one stick at a time in a class that she teaches. I believe the answer to that is an emphatic yes, Kent, and it's available on your website. Can you tell people where that is?
We have a website called the Methow Beaver Project. If you search for Methow Beaver Project, you'll find it easily. And then on the left side is a link to the film, plus some other beaver resources there. One of the things I want to highlight is the fact that this program is not necessarily about beavers, but just one example of a technique that we have employed to try to find solutions. Laura in the film says the beauty of adaptation is finding a way to say, I'm going to work on the things that I'm responsible for to the best of my ability. And that was the encouragement for me to connect with this webinar and give people a chance to say, what can I do? Are there others of you that have examples of things that you're doing that you could share with us while we're here? I would love to hear some examples from you that are things that you're doing.
And if you're an attendee with an example, go into the questions or the chat and say, pick me, and then we can go up and unmute you so that you can share something.
We have a shy audience.
We do have a large but shy audience. Would any of the panelists like to share another example of something else that they're doing in the region?
I'll throw one more thing out here, and I'm really pleased with our leadership with the Forest Service here to do. We've had some significant impacts this spring with a significant runoff, a big snowpack, and then more runoff, rainstorms. We are shaping some of our road systems with drivable crossings rather than culverts so that that can fill up as big as it needs to in big storm events. We've seen big storms here as a climate change expression, and we are trying to find ways to deal with our roads. The vulnerability assessment that was produced by University of Washington showed that road management is going to be one of the biggest things that we have to deal with here across the West. So one way we're trying to do that is just removing culverts and placing ways for vehicles to drive through those crossings.
Thanks, Kent. Well, I want to thank all of our great panelists for bringing us up to speed on the diverse array of examples that they're moving forward to make adaptation happen. And thank you to the listeners for joining us today, be it live or when you hear the recording. Please feel free to point colleagues who could not attend today's broadcast to the recorded version once it's posted on the Climate Adaptation Knowledge Exchange, and you'll receive those links in your email. Additionally, I have asked all of the presenters today to share one or two items that they think highlight what they presented on the webinar or things they didn't get to that they want you to know about, which will also be in that email that you'll be getting. When you go to check out the webinar recording on CAKE, make sure you look at the hundreds of other adaptation resources that are there, including case studies and publications relevant to today's panelists. So when you go to share the recording of today's webinar, check out everything else at CAKE. The National Adaptation Forum Series webinar series runs quarterly, unless a great topic comes up sooner. If you'd like to recommend a topic or are interested in partnering with the National Adaptation Forum webinar series and co-hosting a webinar, please email us at info@nationaladaptationforum.org. We have several more webinars developing for 2017, including a webinar in September on rapid vulnerability assessments, so stay tuned. On behalf of EcoAdapt, thank you all for tuning in.